What you are witnessing is a reenactment of what I remember as the earliest recallable memory from my childhood. I don't know how old I was, but in some childlike innocence it seemed like magic was taking place right before my eyes. Somehow a stick made a mark and that mark didn't disappear. Hello everyone, my name is David Kittler and I still love to draw. I teach a number of workshops, and I can't count the number of times that I've seen professional artists, people who are selling their work, struggling with the basic principles of drawing. Some will be strong in one area, whether it's from their imagination. Some will be strong from another area where it's the three-dimensional realm, and a lot rely on photos. I hope to make all three sources of reference gathering accessible to the artist watching this workshop. It's my intention to break drawing down to its fundamental basics and show you how to glean information from all three reference gathering sources. This is what it's all about, a simple pencil. I've heard it said that a pencil can leave a mark 30 miles long, and I want to remind you that that so-called talent is nothing more than mile after mile of pencil on paper. Pencils are made out of two ingredients. One is clay and one is graphite. Pencils are graded on the B side and the H side. And if you thought of H equaling hard and B equaling black, you'd have a little bit to remind you of which direction the numbers are going when I say 2B, 3B, 6B, and beyond, up to 9B in the case I have. Every time you see a B with a bigger number, it's getting blacker or softer. Something that comes to mind when I hear soft is that there is a lot of graphite in a soft pencil. And in the harder pencils, there's more clay. Clay doesn't make a mark, graphite does. But graphite needs clay to hold it together or else it'll just shatter. It's a dust, basically. So if you're sharpening a pencil that has a lot of graphite in it, and it keeps breaking, especially in the higher numbers, it's not that the pencil's cheap, it's that you've probably dropped it a few times and it's shattered all the way along the shaft. And every time you sharpen it, you get to the broken spot and it falls out. So you have to treat these pencils delicately. The harder pencils are numbered the same way, 2H, 3H, 6H and beyond. And the higher you go with that number, 9H in this case, the less of a mark it's going to make. But each pencil has its position or its use as an item in your toolbox. So you have to have a range of them. If at minimal I told you to get a 3H, a 3B, and an HB, you'd have a lot of options with those pencils. But I'd also throw in one of the higher and lower, if you want to think of it, the softer or harder pencils, to do what we're going to do next. What your experiment is going to be is to take a harder pencil and press as hard as you can and see how dark you're able to make it. And there's a lot of pressure on here, but I'm not making a lot of mark. If I go to the other end of the spectrum and take a softer pencil and push it hard, it takes no effort to get it dark. That's giving us a foundation of a range of values that we want to work with. If I took the middle pencil, the one you get on the golf course, the bowling alley, or wherever else you frequent, it's called an HB pencil, and it's, like I say, the middle of the road. It already, with a lot less pressure, gets it darker, but I don't think, and I'll try it here, that I could ever get as dark as that 9B made it because it doesn't have as much graphite in it. What I'd hope you'd do is with a pencil set or the options that you have, you could take a pencil like an HB and make it a little darker and soften up on your strokes as you get a 9B to get a little lighter. But what I want to see is a gradation happen so that you start getting a feel of the range that your pencils are able to go through. If all you can afford or all you own are 3 pencils, try it with the 3H, the HB, and the 3B, and try getting a successive gradation. And what we'd end up with is a range of values from light through to dark. mechanical pencils that look like this, where you buy leads that you load at the top end of the pencils, and little lead, I don't know if that's 0.5 millimeters, fit into the bottom, and you can put a bunch in at a time. And if you put the eraser back on and the cap on that, you have a nice musical instrument, okay? But it serves more of a purpose. Its big brother would be the technical pencils, where you buy the leads in long lengths and they fit inside of the shaft, and they're quite larger compared to the ones I showed you earlier. The difference with these pencils is they're not sharpened in a pencil sharpener. They're sharpened in what's known as a lead pointer, and you take that lead and advance it. I'm going to deliberately break one here just so you see that, and it's got a duller point on it. Now, if I take that lead pointer and advance the lead a little bit, stick it inside of the hole and turn it around, you're basically putting the best points you can possibly make on a pencil. And I'm cleaning it off in a little area of cotton there. And now I have a pencil point that will let me get into quite a bit of detail. And depending again on the grade of the pencil, if it's a harder one, that point's going to stay a lot longer. But what I wanted to show you is you can buy graphite in a powder form, but if you save all of the pencil shavings that you've got, you now have a nice medium to work with should you ever want to tone a surface in preparation for drawing. If you then want to take that graphite and erase through it or fix it or do whatever you want, you've got an easy supply that doesn't end up going into the garbage. A bunch of different grades can be put into that, but I save it in a film canister and have a little bit of variety of my medium to work with down the road. When you buy technical pencils, look on the ends of some brands and you'll find it contains its own lead pointer so that you can stick the pencil lead of another pencil in it and turn it and sharpen it in the hole that remains at the back of some of the pencils. Again, it can be cleaned off and used with its own pencil, so keep that in mind. And not all brands do it. I work with about 6 different pencils at any time. The preferred range I work with is 3H, HB, 3B, 6B, 9H, and that's a minimal number. I can put a 6H in there also to complete the set, but sometimes I have an empty holder to work with all the different ranges of leads that exist. The majority of the paper I do my drawing on is Strathmore Bristol. I choose a smooth finish, I look for acid-free, and I want it heavy. Bristol can be bought in different size sheets up to individual sheets. Pads are what I have here. One of the other tools I use when I'm working with Strathmore Bristol is something like a loose sheet of paper that I can rest my hand on. The minute I see acid-free, I'm conscious of not wanting to put any of my acids, my smudges or whatever onto the paper by putting my hand on a good piece of paper. I can sometimes cut a window out of this second sheet of paper to work through, or I rely on something known as a bridge. It's a clear piece of plastic, acrylic, plexiglass, that I've taken and cut a length out of, cut 2 more pieces out of that length I cut and stacked them so that I now have a raised surface. That'll let me work on top of this without touching the drawing surface, and that's what becomes an advantage later on in not seeing my paper turn yellow because of the oils I've put on top of it. Another thing you can do is buy sheets of paper or pads of paper that drawings can be done on. If you were going to work large on a painting, you may only work on one element at a time. So a bird, for example, the leaves in the background or something else. But having a large pad of paper will help. And again, rolls of paper. Anywhere you can find paper, it'll become a valuable tool to the final drawing process. So don't throw anything out, basically. Save it all, from wrapping paper to loose sheets out of the photocopier. It'll come in useful one day. Tracing paper is probably the most important piece of paper next to the drawing surface. So have tracing paper in different size pads, sheets, rolls. You'll use them in different places as you explore different size drawings. If I took a circle and just gave it a fill of a particular color or shade, in this case it's a shade, it's a value, it doesn't look any more dimensional than a quarter sitting on a piece of paper or a hole cut in this paper. There's nothing to say it jumps off. It doesn't have dimension to it. So if you were to look at this circle and start thinking, what would happen if I gave it a light source? If you have a light source that's strong, you have to imagine the darkest part of this round object being right here, and it's known as a core shadow area. Okay? The light will not be able to hit this area. And as this area gets a little towards the edge, it starts picking up a little bit of what's known as reflected light. So what I'd suggest and hope you do is set up some objects and take a look and see if this really happens, that in sunlight, the darkest dark on an object is somewhere around here at its core shadow. I've slightly rotated the light source, and you'll understand in a second why I did that, so that it has a little bit of dimension. The area of this ball, think of it in your mind as being blue, pink, red, green. It doesn't matter what value or color we put here, but it should be getting more of that intensity towards the shadow, so that if it was green, for example, it would be lighter here and getting darker green till it joins this shadow area and almost obscures right at this edge. What you'll then have is an area that's going to be highlighted, and it's over here. And a lot of artists are afraid to do what's known as burn out a highlight or take an edge out. And they will have an outline all the way around the object, but the minute you take that off and soften some of these other areas, it just allows the eye to fill in that edge and create a little bit more believability. This outline, for example, is too dark for what I had intended the color to be. So I'm just going to put a softer outline or edge there. And now just blending with my finger, it doesn't have to be a finger. Obviously, I could spend more time drawing with pencil on top of pencil, but do you see how we're starting to get a little bit more roundness in this object? And if I took a darker pencil, I could build this value up even more and create a little bit of roundness, hopefully implying that there's form to this now. The next thing I wanted to concentrate on is the shadow that this object would cast. If we want to anchor it to the ground, then a shadow is going to be apparent. And the light source from the sun travels in parallel lines, and it will miss this ball or sphere or whatever and end up casting its longest point parallel to where that line would end up. If you look at this example of a pencil held up in the sunlight, what you'll notice is that right to the edge of the pencil, it's pretty crisp all the way along. If I show you a picture taken in indoor lighting conditions with an incandescent light, you'll notice that the shadow nearest the pencil is very dark and strong, but it starts immediately fading out and becoming less obvious the further away it is from the pencil. The intensity of the light source in the daylight will be a lot stronger. The darkest shadow is usually here, and next to the object, it'll start fading away. If you want to make the viewer of your art move to a certain part of your drawing, then the idea is to use something as simple as a gradation to move the viewer's eye to where you want them to look. In this case, I'm trying to have them look at this sphere. So I want to take and darken some areas, but I want this area here to have some gradation in it. I don't want to do what the sunlight has, even though I know in the sunlight this edge is crisp and dark pretty much through this whole shape. I'm going to leave it darker towards the object to lift it off and tone it out as I go further away. Whether I soften the edge or not is a choice you'll make as an artist. If I take the cone as the next shape that I want to show you, same thing applies. The darkest dark is going to be here. And I'm deliberately doing something wrong so I can correct myself. Okay? When I'm drawing, I should be drawing in this direction to create the roundness of it. But sometimes there's too many things to think about, and you want to take care of committing the one thing you don't want to forget first, which is in this case the darkest darks. So I'm putting in some shading in this direction just to remind myself that that's the gradation I want, and later I can do it with a finger, I can do it with a blending stump, but I can do the shading I want at a a later time in the direction I want. But it's an important part of this process to start thinking that you're drawing in the roundness or the contour of the actual object. If you'll notice how I'm holding the pencil, it's not magic, but it allows me to do some smudging and cleaning off using the side of the pencil or the edge of the pencil basically. What I've found is that if you hold a pencil like I'm doing right now, to create that arc, I'm limited. I have to lift my hand to do something. But if I took my fingers and held the pencil like this, I could do a lot larger arc without, it's not pretty maybe, but I've got more control over the amount of space I can travel with that pencil. So I can hold it like this between the two fingers. Think of smoking a cigarette, only I hope you don't smoke. And if you could try different things, don't get into a habit. You've always drawn this way, so that's the way it has to be. No, give that up. The shadow of this previous object could now come in and tie into that second shape that I've drawn, and we've created a little bit more volume or dimension to this painting. Now that I've got cast shadows from the object, the core shadow of the object, and a shadow that it's left on this new object that's side by side. And having that variation where it got gradated here, getting a little lighter, allows this shadow here to stay a little bit varied so the two don't meld into each other and get lost, right? Okay, if I was a little exaggerating on the darks, I could take an eraser and pull out some of these highlights, and it's not going to make the artwork any less believable if I don't have an outline in it. I've mentioned that a lot of people draw from different sources, three-dimensional, two-dimensional, and one-dimensional, and I'm calling it imagination for one-dimensional. A lot of the artists that are strong in the one-dimensional aspect have a problem with too much outline. They're cartoonists. They're used to drawing things with edges on them, and they make a pretty picture and whatever, but they don't fill it with any of these values. So I'm trying to get you familiar with how to do something as simple as putting volume to previously just outlines. If I take this next shadow and think about it the same way I did with the first one, it should be darker next to the object, and as it gets further away it will lighten up. So anticipating that, I'll just do a little bit of shading there and darkening it here. If I took that square and thought about that square as being something that I want to give volume to it, think of it being a cube. Cube then has four sides. We'll see only three of them in this example. But what I can do with the cube is remind you that this outline is not serving any purpose on a white surface. It's a dark line lifting off of a white surface. So I want to tone this area down immediately, take off some of those edges, and put some darks where I want the surface to pop out on. Okay, I want it to lift off of the surface. This whole side, if I filled it with one solid color, would be boring. There'd be no reason for a viewer to look at it, any one corner any differently than the other. So what I'm going to deliberately do is do a gradation. A more dramatic gradation is this horizontal or diagonal one, and as opposed to the horizontal or vertical. There's more energy in this, so that's what I've chosen to do. And if you look at some of the reference, this reference here is from inside, under a desk lamp. You see the gradation happening off of here, getting darker here. These are some other examples where the gradation starts here and gets a little darker at the top. The way it happens depends on the source of light, the reflected light bouncing around it. But even in this example, you can see how it's lighter in the corner, darker up here. Everything I'm doing here can be tested at home. At this point, I've tried to tell you about gradations, and I want to take off some of those back lines too and give this top a little bit of variation in it. We will talk about it later, but I'm going to tell it to you now so you're anticipating it. Every plane, which means a surface, has to be lit differently in nature. There's no way this top plane, call it A, is going to be lit the same way as B or C. If the sun's coming from here, they have to have some difference to them. So toning it a little bit differently is already something I want you to put into your minds to remember that there's a reason for doing it. And a lot of times it's to either keep it from lifting off of the background or here to give the viewer some reason to look through this plane. Even if you've captured their attention only in this area, I want them to have a reason to look from one corner or another. And if you think about that as you're doing even your shadows, that's the next important thing. Because as an artist, it's got to be the most flattering thing to have people stand and look at something you've created out of nothing. Remember, we're talking a simple pencil that is able to get people to stop and look at you and wonder how you managed to make that happen on a piece of paper. Okay? So a gradation is all I'm talking about here, softening it off to the edge. Up to this point, these edges have been pretty hard, and that's the lighting conditions I'm mostly aware of or using myself. But you have to look at where your reference gathering's taking place. If you're drawing flowers in a vase in indoor lighting conditions, remember your shadows are going to be softer. If you're doing things out in the sunlight, that's how your shadows could be. But if you're an artist, not a photocopier, not taking everything so literally, you might say, I'm going to soften my edges when I don't want people to pay attention and harden them where I really want people to look. You use whatever you need to move the viewer to wherever you want them to look. I know you've seen this in countless children's books, how to draw, but it is the most foundational part of art. And if you could start taking some of this and applying it to your art, you're going to be one step closer to making art that is something that people look at and go, wow. Okay? That art you think is so good is because that artist knew how to do this. When I think back to all the times that I've done this example here, the one thing that stops a lot of people is where this core shadow is. So a lot of times the shadow they end up with means it's hard-edged all the way along the back, the darkest dark being right along here. And it's my intention to at least point out that that doesn't always have to happen. It can happen. You can orchestrate your light source so that it does happen by putting nothing to reflect the light back off of it into the object here. But concentrate on where that core shadow is. So that's of prime importance because it allows you to have a light and a light at the edge of each object, and that doesn't lift off of a background the way it would if you had a dark edge here. I'm fond of telling people about light sources, so if I drew a glass like this, and I put hard edges all the way around it, and took a second glass, and just put hard edges along the sides where I wanted you to think there's not as much light coming from. Which one has a light source to it? That's what I want you to look at, that sharpness of that outline. If I then threw some shadows here, you'd be able to understand that there's a light source coming from this direction, and maybe a shadow under here would do the same. So you don't need those hard edges, and that would be the second thing I'd really want to point out. To soften edges is an important part of this exercise, and the shadow treatment itself is the gradation. Okay, so don't have everything solid black all the way along. Have it gradate out so that the viewer's eye is moved towards the object, and that should help you convey a little bit more volume than you're used to seeing in beginning art. What I'd suggest you do at home is find some objects that are going to aid in this process. I've drawn it for you, but I want you to actually be able to handle them, to put them in different light sources and situations. And in this case, I've grabbed a cone, a sphere, a cylinder, and some blocks of wood. Okay? You don't have to know anybody who's a carpenter, but it helps to keep your fingers if you get somebody else to do it. What I also did, and this is man-made almost, most of it is I took a piece of cardboard and made a rectangle. Inside that rectangle, I put some shapes. A cylinder cut out of a piece of paper, stretched around with an end on it and no end in this side. A ball that I got at, I don't even know, a Christmas ornament store, who knows what it is. A cube I made out of cardboard, cut a hole in it just to hold that. And now I've got some props that I can look at and actually see what the light source is doing in different situations. Keeping in mind that the basic shapes make up parts of everything you see in nature, That's why it's being taught to you from a childhood age on. Just a lot of us didn't pay attention to that and find ourselves struggling because we don't want to revert back to something we should have known so many years ago. If I remind the viewer that if you take a circle and you put 4 lines around that circle, you will have a circle fitting inside of a square, touching at 4 spots of that square. In that exercise we just did, what you'll remember is I did a cube. Instead of stopping this cube by putting lines here, I'm going to extend it and make it into a rectangle. If I take that rectangle, and I'm just putting dotted lines so you see through this, and think of the 4 contact points of this cube being the area where a circle would have to be squished into. And I'm basically calling these ellipses now. Okay? Out of this cube, extended cube actually, a rectangle now, you would see that another shape emerges, and it's the cylinder. So if I take a circle and I put a cylinder on that circle, and I take another cylinder and I make another bend to something, and I take a circle that I might flatten out a tiny bit, or if I get lost I'll put a cone on the end of it. If I take a square and I take a triangle and I take cylinders and circles and cylinders again and more cylinders and circles and put a triangle on the end of it, put a cone on it, take another circle. Do you see how simple it was to get to something that looks bird-like in this case? Later on, I can always take and put detail on the end of that bird to make it look like it's feathers that are flying and get into the detail. But I want you to understand that when I draw, this is what I see. This breakdown is something that allows me to concentrate on, once I know how to do shading, to take and put a shadow on something, to give it form with a light source in mind. I can say the bottom part of this should be darker, and I can break it down and cast shadows. But what is more important to me is the freedom that this type of drawing allows, because now I can take that same animal that I see and turn it. If I look at that head and think that that head, a circle on it turned is still a circle, but that cone, once I learn how to take that cone and maybe point it in a different direction, if I know where those eyes line up and I can start turning things, put a cylinder underneath it that's turned, the part of that cylinder that I might see, this round part of the body that's here, the wings that are going up. All I have to do is take and move one shape at a time, and now I'm able to see that from a different direction. If I want to think of those legs as being cylinders still, because they are, but on this one, which is the one I've implied is back here, I want to foreshorten or put a triangle behind it while I keep this one longer. Do you understand how that frees you from looking at a picture and saying, I've got to copy that picture exactly? If you don't have the light source you want, you've just learnt how to take and put your own lighting on something that now gives it dimension. For years, and I was in art college when this happened, I remember teachers saying, oh, you draw so well. I don't know how to draw hands. And I showed them, if you took a hand and simplified it into a block of wood with a cylinder attached to that, and put 4 little, in this case, elliptical circles, ellipses is what I mean, with cylinders attached to it, all of a sudden you have the ability to, using an object right in front of you, divide your hand into the 3 sections that it is, and build the fingers out of those sections. It's easier to take and put a bunch of cylinders into an object and then erase if you want to. If you're getting confused with the lines, figure that out later. But so you won't be pressing as hard as I am. I'm doing this purely for demonstration purposes, starting to draw in a dark pencil. This process is a little too heavy-handed, but it's more so that you understand what the shapes are underneath something. If I took, for example, the circle and said, okay, that circle is applicable to almost every head you're going to see on every animal. But if I took that circle and drew another circle on it, and maybe took a triangle, took a circle, put two more circles on it, are you starting to see something in your mind that asks or begs to be named as maybe, I hope it's a lion, okay? So that I can decide from that circle what it's going to be as it happens. If I want it to be a male lion, I have to do a little bit more detail on it. But do you understand how it's starting to become easier to break things down and see those shapes inside of something? If you become what I call an outline drawer starts at the edge of something and goes all the way around and hopes by the time they come back that every twist and turn they took was exactly the right degree it had to be, so that when they get back to here, they're right on track, and that everything inside fits into that area the same way. What I'm begging you to see is the simplicity of that circle, and maybe the other major chunks, whatever basic shapes are involved, helps you to take a surface, a piece of paper that you may be restricted to because it's a certain size somebody wants it drawn at, or the certain size that you have to fit it into another part of your composition. And taking a circle allows you to maximize or put as much space of that object in there without saying, starting and drawing and finding out you've gone off the piece of paper. So it's my hope that another advantage of doing this basic shape is to help you save time, not have to rework something because it didn't fit on the piece of paper that you had it for. Find some props at home. A book is a square. A box of chocolates, who knows what it might be, might provide a square form to it. A ball, golf ball to tennis ball, anything could become a basic shape that you could use as a model. I would suggest you find a white one because then you'll be able to differentiate between the shadows. And an example I could bring right now is if I took this pad of paper and brought a white object close to it, you'd start seeing some of the reflected light brought into that, depending on which direction the light source is. That is reflecting light into the bottom of that cylinder, and it's another way of reading light that you wouldn't normally do. But because it's a white object, it'll allow you to see that a lot easier. Take a piece of tracing paper, find a piece of reference. Now, the reference I'm showing you here is black and white. It's cheaper. If you've got a digital camera and you're taking a picture, make a black and white copy of it. Print it out just on your black and white because you're doing a value study anyways. In pencil, you want to see the different grades or shades of pencil, and take that object and find some of those basic shapes in there. So I will encourage you always to find the circle. Cylinders are easier to find in long things like legs, fingers, whatever it might be. But do a bunch of tracings over top of it and use those tracings to break down those objects into the basic shapes that are available. We're talking 3 or 4 shapes to begin with, so it shouldn't be that complex. Okay? I told you about the cone maybe at the end of this. And when you've got those basic shapes drawn and you see enough to get you started, you now see how I look at the world. This is what I see when I look at a person, an animal, a building, or whatever, a breakdown into basic shapes. You're not going to run around for the rest of your life with tracing paper and asking people to hold still while you trace their outline or basic shapes off of them. But I want you to understand that this is how you have to see something. If a cat's lying down or a bird plops down on a piece of concrete next to you, you want to know that there's a few shapes involved in getting that bird's anatomy, and that bird's going to fly away. He's going to be gone. But you can then start saying, okay, now I remember that, or each successive pose or that bird comes in and gives you a little bit more information. You can take and develop those poses, putting the eyes where they belong. And there's a lot of times I've heard people say they have a photographic memory. I'm talking artists especially. And then I see that they'll put the eyes in the wrong spot or the beak in the wrong spot. They've got enough information quickly, but they just don't have it in the right spot. What I'm hoping you'll do is start zeroing in and saying, oh, this bird has this, depending on whether it has long legs or I don't know which bird I'm thinking. So, that could become a bird recognizable to someone who knows their birds. the simplicity of seeing a pose and being able to turn it is what I'm getting at. So take lots of reference, put them in black and white form, because that's all you need, and start taking a piece of tracing paper and tracing out some of those obvious shapes. I will take a circle, and even though that circle doesn't fit entirely that head has a little bit more width to it, I want to make sure that the eye is located in that circle. If I have that done, I'm laughing, okay? In this case, this bird has a beak that's long, okay? You could think of a cone shape, and that's what I'm trying to break that down to. In front of it might be a triangle. Don't ignore those things if they help you. But in my mind right now, I'm thinking as a teacher that I want to see where that beak's going to line up in relation to the center of that circle. It's no good, if I didn't intend it, to have the beak pointing in some other direction if I know it points at 7:30 or 8 o'clock in this case. So at 8 o'clock is where that line's running out. Again, I'm trying to free you from the pressures of numbers, except I guess 8 is a number. Instead of angles and degrees, I want you to think of just something that simplifies it, okay? In the neck itself, I want it dimensional. If I thought of it just as a square, that's still flat. I don't feel the roundness of it. So by turning it into the cylinder, I'm getting a feeling of roundness. When I think of round, and again, like the head almost, I'd rather work with a circle. A circle's a lot easier to replicate. You can figure out if you screwed up a circle pretty quickly by rotating it a few degrees or 90 degrees or 180, and you'll see if you've skewed it a little bit. But a circle has to be round. You can use templates if you have to. I do have students who rely on that, but they're a little nervous. And I keep telling them, if you can't draw a circle, think of a square. Square fits around a circle. So if you're not sure, if you've got some problem with your eyesight stigmatism or your glasses distorted or whatever is going to happen, think about a square and put a circle in there. If it fits comfortably inside of a square, 4 equal sides, then you've got a circle. And the reason I use a circle again is so that I can do things like finding that center point and bringing those legs off of that center point. Okay, so I know that these cylinders, which will end up articulating at a joint, and I'll usually put a circle in the joints, will join another cylinder. Okay. So if there's extra areas like this here, shoulder, I could turn it into a cone, or a cut-off cone, or leave it as a triangle. Similarly with the tail of this particular bird. I could break it down into the patterns that are underneath its wing feathers, which are here and here, or its tail feathers. But I'm going to remove the drawing, or the reference material, and let you see the blocked-in drawing. Okay? So to give it dimension, we can break it down into those shapes. This is how I see my world, in a bunch of blocks and shapes and cylinders and whatever else. So if you're ever meeting me in person, that's probably what I'm thinking about, how everything's lined up on your face and on your body. Okay. I was never very good at math, and actually am to this day not very good. But I think with my students that there's something I can show them, and that's to take a circle, like I'm doing right now, and make it into an easier thing to work with. If you know you can cut it in half and section it up into basic pie sections, if you want to call it. But if you put a mark here and a mark here and a mark here, and repeat it on the other side, you'll find that you've simplified your drawing a little bit more if you think of it as hands of a clock, and you think of this being 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2, 3, and so on. And what will happen is you'll be able to find sometimes, if you use a circle in every head you draw, for example, you'll be able not only to position the eyes in this example in a particular quadrant, but you'll even be able to figure out angles a little easier, so that you're not going to always be using tracing paper, and I hope you realize that. But when you are looking at something, you'll be able to turn your pencil or brush or whatever you're using and calculate angles in your mind, but that will help you translate it onto the two-dimensional form you're working on. Whether it's a board, canvas, paper, whatever you end up working on, you've simplified it, which is the whole point of art, and that's what I'm trying to show you here. If I look at these flowers here, the first thing I notice is they're not round, they're more elliptical. And if I talk to you about an ellipse, I'll mention to you that there's a major and a minor axis in an ellipse. Okay, the major axis is the long part of that ellipse, and the short part is called the minor. And if you get those things right, where the widest part is where the coincides, and put a 90-degree angle where the bisecting minor axis is, it's usually where the center of a flower will be, or the hub of a bicycle wheel. So a flower is not much different than a bicycle wheel if you think about the spokes coming out of it. What I hope will happen through the course of this DVD is that you'll learn that the thing about an artist is not how to hold this pencil. It's how to notice what you're looking at. It's to see. Okay? So if you start taking nature and finding things that make sense in it, the axes of an ellipse may sound like math, but it's an important thing to get that flower skewed and angled in the right direction. In nature, there's a lot of things to notice, and it depends on how detailed you want to get. The arrangement of these petals can be broken down into that ellipse again, or in this case it's more circular. And the spoke-like features of these petals are the first thing I do, obviously in a lighter pencil, but I'm trying to show you so it shows up on camera, that these spokes might be the first thing I'm looking for. If a leaf is folded or a petal is folded and there's two halves to each section or each petal, then it's okay to draw that line and leave it, but not in every case will that happen. And then I'll take and flesh out that petal once I've found out which direction the main part of it is. Think of the center to the point as being your goal when you start and stop the pencil. And then the rest will be just to fill it in, to build whatever contour or outline shape that you want to think about. Continuing on with flowers, I wanted to show you maybe two more examples. If I look at this particular flower, again, I want you to notice the major axes of what would be known as the ellipse here. And I try to incorporate most of the petals into that. If one hooks out of the plane that it's on, that's fine. And remember again that the minor axes, which we don't see but is perpendicular to this particular flower, will be something you'd include also. Think of a strawberry, a cone that's got a softer top on it, as a way to simplify that shape. If you want to, at this particular point, put the petals on, again, aim them from the center and think about their orientation to each other and the gaps in between it. Do this lightly so that you will be able to put more of the energy on the outside of the lines, because right now we're talking about a linear drawing. It's going to look like a Mexican hat maybe, but that's the whole point of this. These simple shapes can be found in everything. So by putting that hat-like feel to this plant, you can change your mind and maybe do a sombrero one day, okay? But the negative shapes, the spaces that are left over, are something else that I use when I'm drawing. So take a look at the shape itself of the plant and its location, but also the other parts. I'm going to try to line this up approximately. And what I'm going to do is draw the negative shape, that area that's not the petal, it's more the background. Those are areas to really concentrate on if you have any trouble working with that actual positive shape of the petal. Sometimes just drawing a whole bunch of these negative shapes will let you end up with a flower anyways. I prefer this kind of pencil. Believe me, when I'm in the jungles, I'm sitting with a little pencil like this doing a lot of drawing because I can get a lot done quickly. But I noticed when I was in Panama this recent trip studying the harpy eagle that the paper just wouldn't take the pencil very well. So any talk of an eraser was out of the question because I switched to pen, and it was a more permanent and less forgiving, let's say, medium. Drawing with a pen will force you to think simple shapes because you don't have much time to correct things. and you want to get as few lines as possible. So if I continue these outside of that shape, I basically have a flower done just by drawing the negative shapes. In this example, what I wanted to do is get away from the ellipse and just show you how simple triangles could be. If I wanted to take and put this particular plant down quickly, I'd be thinking either the triangles that are on the outside or, oh, ran out of pencil lead there. And that would be a way to concentrate or break down that particular plant. Now, if I wanted to continue, I'd make sure that those lines all originated from the center. I just didn't want to confuse you with too many lines because we are trying to simplify things. And the outer lines all converge from these three triangles here, will converge on the center also. And in this particular center, whatever happens, the pistils and stamens that come up will not be in the center, but they all originate from that middle. I'm sure you've all seen a tree stump, and what it would look like is something like this, okay? And in this case, you'd see the rings of the tree here, but imagine that a tree right beside it has been cut off at eye level, and it has a flat area because our eye level, we know there's a top to it. We know we could put something on there, but we can't see it because it's where the horizon line or our eye level is. Imagine this tree in my imaginary world being cut off and a section has been taken out of that tree. Okay? The branches are held up by this other tree that's beside it, which we'll come to in a minute. And what we're able to see is, remember the rings going here? We can't see the rings here, but we can see the rings here. That's something I need you to keep in mind when we talk about light source. Because if I bring in a light source from one side or the other, and this will be the sunlight, light is going to hit this side of the tree and brighten it up. Remember where we took out outlines, we didn't need that edge, but the tree itself is going to have texture. In this case, it's bark. Okay, and it's going vertically, and I'm doing it as nice as I can to be dark here. But the viewer doesn't see a lot of information from this except texture. As an artist, you have to learn to do your shading in the direction that places the viewer somewhere in the picture that you're working with, so that your strokes will go in this round direction when it's above eye level and straighten out when it's at eye level and go around lower down when it's below eye level. And where that becomes important is if you want to draw something like a branch. A branch drawn out in the side is pretty much straight lines, but as you get further away, you may decide to curve your strokes and show the viewer that that's going out of the picture. And if you notice, there's a gradation to it. If I want to have a branch coming out into the foreground, that's how I have to learn to shade that branch. Okay, in my brush strokes, if it's painting or if it's in pencil, to just shade with the pencil in that direction. It's establishing the form, and if I want it to go into the distance, fading out lines, going very small, and you'd have that if it was behind the tree. If I want something to come right out to me, it may actually be, even though it's the smallest part of that branch, it may become the biggest part of this drawing, and that's called foreshortening. Okay? But I'm not so much talking about the perspective now as I am talking about getting all this information so that it looks like it's lifting off the page. The direction of our shading is important. In this example, we're not using color, but I can show you a little bit better that this light source would come in and hit the front of this tree and obviously lighten it up a little bit. But it would hit this tree and bounce back and give some light source to the back side of the tree. Okay, this is an example of something you can do at home. If you can find a broomstick, chop it into a few pieces, stack a couple cans of soup, whatever it might be, and see if you can figure out the rings. Even something as simple as looking at a mug will allow you to look at it at eye level, below eye level, and above eye level, and see the arc that that circle is going to make. When you see a good artist, or a good piece of art, what you're going to notice is that the artist used the range of values from one end to the other. It's not that they put every value everywhere in the picture. They learned how to move the viewer's eye to a specific spot of the picture by saying, I'm going to use my highest and lowest contrast somewhere here, and everything else from that area is going to fade away. So more and more values, more and more detail, attention, and all that are going to be applied to this area. But since we're talking about values, this is the first principle I want you to understand, that saving your values, the lightest light and your darkest darks for where you want people to look, is a good step at getting to the final product, and a nice final product at that. Most people I come across, like myself at one time, would take ranges of values and feel comfortable in them. Like, I'd find people who would take a certain area and feel really comfortable in and throw in maybe a dark. Or if they're a dark person and they were used to working at this end of the spectrum, or the value scale as I call it, they would have a lot less comfort in this zone. They'd always want to be what I call the dark people. They'd work with a range of maybe this here area, this 30%, and throw in something from the light end. Just as those people from this end might work with their 30% and throw in something from the dark. And there are middle people also. If you think of this as being, this range, as being 10 gradations plus the white of the paper, think of it applying to the finished price of a drawing. And I like to put in other examples. So one of the things I think of is, imagine somebody was offering you $1,000 for this particular drawing. And on every value, they put a $100 bill. And they said, if you use this value, you get to keep that $100. I'm sure you'd strive to get every one of those values in there to get your $100 per section, right? Well, a lot of artists don't do that, and they have drawings that are either too weak, too dark, too middle ground without any of the extremes. I'm really trying to reinforce that it's an important part of the drawing process to use all the values. In this example, I wanted to show you some of my old sketchbooks to show you where I didn't do that, where the face is a lot more washed out than I intended it to be. It even had some help because it got smudged over the years. But drawings like this, where I'd concentrate on more of the detail and getting some darks in certain areas, but we all know, and if I give the example of my hand to this piece of paper, the skin color is not that light. Okay, so she's looking a lot more washed out than she should. Guilty as charged is basically what I'm saying. I do the same thing and I have done the same thing. So now, recognizing that, I've gone a little further, and my recent drawings should have more of the use of values in them than I had before. But check your own work and see if you are using that entire range. And get your $1,000. What I like to do every so often with a student is ask them to get a value scale that they've made with pencil and take a hole punch and punch out the hole and save that little dot. If you take out one of the dots from each of the areas and position them around the board, you'll test whether or not you've used your range of values, which is one of the purposes of the exercise we're working on. In most of my paintings, what I'm trying to do is get the viewer to look to a certain spot. Usually it's the animal's eye, but it could be something else. I am more of a portrait artist, and I prefer to concentrate on the personality of the animal through, a close-up, intimate look at it. So when I'm thinking about eyes, that's pretty much where I'm going to put my darkest dark and lightest lights, and most of the detail and whatever else I can find in there. But in this instance, I will try to use some of those dots to figure out if I've represented a lot of the range. Another thing you can do is take your drawing and stick it under your hole punch and see if the values are represented through the holes you've cut previously, and test to just check off that you've used at least some of the values that are in that range. Okay? Another thing to do is to take a piece of tracing paper. If you're not happy with your drawing, take a sheet of tracing paper and say, it wouldn't be a bad thing if I made it a little darker here, or work on top of the tracing paper. If you're too light in an area, like under this eye, you might say, I'm just going to try and see if it looks a little darker. or it looks a little better darker. And you haven't risked anything. And last, if it's accessible to you, which it pretty much is on every street corner in a city, is try to find a photocopier. Take a photocopy of your picture and work on top of it rather than ruining a drawing. One of the things that I tell people to try to do is if they assume that too dark is right here, if their problem is using the dark end of the value scale, I ask them when they start a painting to try going to that spot where they think too dark actually is. And then I ask them to ruin the drawing in their minds, go further. And what they're going to discover is that they stopped way too soon here, and they're going to get to the spot where they should have stopped. But I want them to continue going even further and make it a mistake. But then they can look around and see not only where they should have stopped, but that they were wrong when they stopped here or thought that this is the stopping point. So it's really forcing you through ruining a drawing to go beyond what you had to learn from your mistakes. And they say that a really good artist has to make 2,000 mistakes, so get busy and start making them. To take a colored piece of plastic and look through it will turn your color world into a breakdown of values. Okay, I choose a red piece of plastic because when I paint and the subjects I observe, there's not a lot of red in it, and that will allow me to filter out the red, but to not lose the greens, the blues, the oranges, or whatever I am particularly interested in my pictures. I think we've touched on most of what I wanted to talk about with values. The only thing I'll remind you about, and just give you confidence to work and pursue this a little harder, is that if it doesn't look right in black and white, it's not going to look better in color. If you can get that base, that foundation, that the basic shapes and the values allow you to create, then you're going to have a way better head start towards great art. Each pencil can be used for different effects. I'm holding a 9H pencil in my hand, and I wanted to show you something because we've seen earlier how I can use it and it barely makes a mark. And I can almost press it so hard if I use a sharp point and tear the paper. It has its advantages and it has its disadvantages. Obviously, sometimes I'm not interested in scoring the paper, and it happens if I put too much pressure, but I'm just going to show you an example of something I want you to see now. If I take a 9H pencil, press it as hard as I can on a piece of paper, and then erase so that I got any trace of it off of the drawing surface. Okay, you might still see a glare, that's fine. But if I take a softer pencil, I'm using an HB now, and go over that, I see that 9H appear. And when I take a 9H pencil and press as hard as I can, any softer pencil is going to skip over that area. It's not going to be as dark as it is on the object or the line that I used previously. So that should tell you that if you take a bunch of lines with a harder pencil, I'm using the 9H now, and I put other grades of pencil over top of it, that each layer is going to leave layers. There's going to be gaps in between it. It's not just a bunch of lines. There's actual color and the white of the paper right now, but as I put more soft lines over top of that, I'll still have texture happening in those lines. So sometimes I can take a bunch of pencils and do it all at once. If I want variations like highlights and whatever happening, I take a bunch of pencil a lot of times and do dots if I'm trying to do texture. In the same way I did lines like this, I can take a scalpel, and I'm not using this blade part of the scalpel, I'm using the back end of it, and I can score the paper lightly. I'm not trying to cut through it, but if I score the paper and take another pencil, again the HB, and do lines across it, you'll understand that some lines show up. And that hatching and cross-hatching is something I'll use if I have a dark surface, like if I want to do cat whiskers. If I want those lines to show up on a dark surface, I can pre-score the paper. Sometimes if you're not working on a smooth surface, you will actually get debris build up underneath. And what I've taken here is a little bit of salt. Could have been anything, sand, pencil shavings. And if I take a hard pencil and go over that, I create texture instantly. I can go in different directions and even change the grade of pencils I use and build up gradations in that. And that's a way to get a lot of texture. But that's using, I call it an artificial means. If I want to take a bunch of pencils and create that same effect, I just have to choose different grades, group a bunch of pencils, and do the same stippling pattern. It can get monotonous after a while, but I can achieve that where I still can take and do gradations with a softer or harder pencil over it to tone the background. So little experiments are techniques waiting to be used. On a two-dimensional surface, we have width and we have height, but we don't have that third dimension of depth, and I want to try to bring that into our drawing now by using a little checklist that I've devised over the years of things that you can look for in your particular artwork or the artwork of others to see if they've done this correctly. Now, as I use the word depth, I want you also to equate it to an area of attention. So when you think of some paintings, you may not want a lot of depth. It may just be a portrait, for example, but it might be somewhere in that portrait that you want us to look. And that means everything else has to focus to that particular point, and that's what I'm trying to get you to think about when we're going down this checklist. And the first is size. If I take a typical country road, for example, we've got a horizon line somewhere in the distance and a point on it, and we want to have one point perspective in this case, but we'll have a row of telephone poles traveling beside that road. The telephone poles that are in the distance, they're going to be a lot shorter, basically. And the ones that are up near us are going to have some width to them, and they're going to be a lot taller. And they'll be showing us a light source and shadow, but we'll talk about that next, coming up in the list. So this telephone pole, make your own style, I'm just using it as an example, might have a few things happening to it, and we'll come back later and check on that. But the ones in the middle will have varying heights also till we get to the one in the foreground. Maybe that one was a little bit too much, but we can edit that out. If I take these telephone poles and lighten them a little bit, but still keep the height noticeably different, you're going to feel that the ones that are smaller are further away. Artists have a hard time knowing how to put the next thing and where to place the next thing in the proper spot going into the perspective. So let me give you a little primer here if you want to think of it that way. If you take the height of this fence post and put a line at the bottom and the top and draw through that spot all the way to that same vanishing point off into the distance. Take another line, and I'll make it a dotted one here, that follows the midpoint between those two lines all the way down to that same vanishing point. Somehow you're going to have to start with a fence post. You're going to say another one belongs here, and I'm just making that as an arbitrary decision. If I take the top of this post, go through the middle of this line where that line intersects that post, and continue a straight diagonal, that will show me where the next post is in the right placement. And if I start at the top of this one, going through the next to the same thing through a diagonal, I'll get to another spot. And continuing that through all the way down will show me where each successive post should be positioned. Keep in mind that this is on a smooth surface. If I do decide one time to put a hill into this picture, all I have to do is take the height that that post occupies at that spot and move it up so that that post will now follow the contour of the ground. So we've talked about size as a way to convey depth. The bigger the thing is, the closer it appears. If I take something like this pencil and place it where this post is, and think of another post falling in front of it, there's no way you can conceivably think of this one being behind that pencil. or that post. So putting something in front of something else will indicate that it's closer to us, and overlap is something to keep in mind. One of the biggest mistakes I see beginning artists do, and think way back, and this should be obvious, how far back I'm going. If you see a child's art, they'll draw a house with the chimney, with the smoke, with the sun, and nothing touches anything else. So if you're afraid to do what is needed in art, to have overlap, then it's going to revert back to this type of drawing where nothing touches anything else. So every so often, keep overlap in mind. It's something that will keep your art from becoming childlike, and it'll push you into the real world where there is overlap. Okay, in this case, this post would be, causing an accident very soon. If we look back to our scenario on the country road, the insulators that are on top of those telephone poles will imply that we've observed a little bit more about what's happening closer to us, and further away those become dots and not distinct at all. Grasses might be something that appear closer. Flowers in the grass might be something that brings our attention to this area, where way back we may just rely on those dots I was showing you earlier, stippling or whatever it might be, to create a little bit of what's going on down the road. If I took this road itself and thought about it as a gradation, further down the road, we'd be dealing with another element to create depth, and that's working with values. So this road, having some contrast to it, a little bit more darks here, and even if I took the salt we had shown you earlier and done a rubbing on top of this, we could create detail in the road, lessening further down. And in this case, on this post, the darkest darks are here, with the lightest lights being here, trying to create a gradation, moving you into the picture. I guess this is a subliminal hawk that I had drawn on this post, so we'd have to lessen his appearance by taking an eraser and just blotting off some of that. Outline or edge treatment. It's a tough one to deal with because it's not detail. It's not quite the same. One of the ways I show it to the students is I take a regular piece of paper and tear it. And whatever that random edge is, it's going to be pretty sharp if I take and use a pencil against the background to create a lot of contrast. You'll see that there's an edge forming. And if I wanted to do a gradation, for example, I could take that paper and do a nice gradation, but the closer the edges are in value, the better. And I don't want distinct detail or edge treatment there, and I'll try to limit it through something that either this done with a pencil, or I'll take a cotton swab and already just rub onto that background. But where I see more of this edge treatment consideration is if I take the corresponding piece. So I've ripped this paper in two, and if I take the piece that I had used, then I can flip it over, line it up, and sometimes soften the other edge below it using that same pattern to create maybe foothills or less distinction between them, and it's not the same as values. Now if I took this sky here and took the cotton swab, found another area where I could rub some dust off of it, and just continue the same treatment at the bottom, I might be able to soften those lines, and going over both of them would do the same. Taking an eraser and erasing out of that area would give us the appearance of clouds. And I know I haven't got it very dark here, so I can still put more layers on, but the impression is to use an eraser, a blending stump, something to just soften the edges. I know we haven't talked about the blending stump, but it's a piece of paper that can be dipped into graphite, and I'll just charge this with a little bit more. And I'll use the tip of this rolled up piece of paper basically to draw with. So if I have something I want to accentuate, like the bottom of a cloud, I will start with a blending stump, usually softening it with a piece of paper or in this case cotton batten. And if my sky needs to be darkened, I can continue the process. I'm going to try to use another picture that shows a few of those elements that I'm talking about in this particular drawing. If you look at this goat, the highest contrast is in the front. It's the animal itself that you notice. But in the background, there are clouds, there's soft areas. The value difference between the mountains and the sky is hard to distinguish between. But when we get into the trees that are down in this area, you'll notice that you can see the edge. It's sharper. These rocks are the same composition that are on those mountains. If you were to walk along that edge of this mountain, you'd find all that detail or edge crispness. And I'm trying to differentiate between detail, but back here you smoothen out the line. You straighten it out and you don't make the jump too noticeable from background to foreground using values. It's basically softening it, straightening it out, putting less of that detail in there. As much as you might be tempted to show people that if you were walking along here, you'd see little rocks and boulders and everything that you might trip over, you refrain from that back here and show more of that edge along here, that sharpness, along the tree line, the crispness that might be along there, or the fur. Color comes in two different forms. There's the type of color and the amount of color. So in the background, you would use cooler colors versus warmer colors, and in the background you'd use fewer colors versus more colors. So it doesn't apply when we're using black and white, but it's something I want you to know because this checklist can be applied to any type of art. Think of railroad tracks that you've seen and how they go off into the distance. The ties that the railroad track is on are what I want us to focus on right now. If you have a train track and the ties that run underneath it, the tie in the front is going to have thickness to it. And further off, the next tie to this is going to be a little smaller and a little shallower in height, and the gap between it and the next one are going to get even increasingly shorter. So this gap here and this gap here will diminish. And as these ties go into the background, some of the rules that we talked about depth will apply. If there was detail here, the gravel in between it, or blades of grass, the gravel here is going to be less and less. The space and the thickness of the ties themselves are going to be lessened. And further away, you're going to end up getting to basically nothing, where all the lines almost converge. Okay? So you won't see a lot of information here as opposed to here. But where that applies so often when I'm teaching is when somebody wants to do water. In the distance, the waves have to be very small, like those train ties. But in the foreground, the waves have to be quite large. So the closer you are, the more length on the waves and height you have on the waves, just the same as you do on the ties. So keeping that in mind when you're drawing, your lines, if they're getting small further away, will convey a little bit more in the depth. If you think of this as grass and you think, boy, the height of that tie versus the height of this, the grass here can be really tall, and as it gets further away, it starts getting proportionally smaller. So think about that and how less detail you want here, less height, and more of that you want in the foreground. If we take a horizon line, similar to the demonstration I did with the fence, you might want to think about how tall a person is when you're looking at them in a picture versus somebody else further into the picture. So if I simplified a person as being three shapes, it's not anything important, the eye level may be where the horizon line is. I can do the same thing I did with the fence post and project lines. This spot is an arbitrary one. I could have chosen a spot anywhere along this line for those lines to converge in. And like our fence posts or telephone poles or whatever, any spot along those lines are going to be equivalent to the height of that person wherever you want to place them in this picture. That doesn't mean that that person and this person have to stand there. I could take this guy or girl or whoever it's going to be that might be in this area and move them, just take that height, move them anywhere along this line, and they become elements in the right proportion at the right distance in the painting, okay? Or drawing in this case. So if you want to learn how to do things like that, if you're filling sketchbooks, whatever it is, start thinking about their relationship to somewhere in perspective. If this person, for example, were talking to somebody in a hole, and looking up was the person in the hole, you'd know how big to make the head because of how big this person is, even though half of them is buried underground, okay? So if that person was bent over or handing that person something, then that height would be based on how high it was here. If this person was on a hill and you wanted to know how tall that person would be on that hill, you'd take that dimension and move it so that same person would be that high at this point in the picture. It's important to know a little bit about perspective. I'm going to try to simplify it, keep it easy because we're not going to get too intense with this. But what I've got is a piece of paper with a line drawn across it. This is not my friend. There's not a lot of straight lines in nature, and I don't like using a ruler. So automatically, I tend to put it out of the picture. In perspective, we have to work with straight lines to make sense of this. Not to confuse you, but to put things right. Remember that 1 point perspective has 2 rules. Anything that is in this direction, going left to right, has to be parallel to that center or horizon line. So if I want to draw a box in this scenario, I might choose my bottom line to be here, but rather than using a ruler, I'll just make a mark on a piece of paper and take that over to the other side. And now I know that distance to that distance is the same. I can use a ruler, a straight edge if I want. And to keep it clean for once in this workshop, I'll actually use a ruler. Now, to get an angle correct is guesswork in this case, because I'm not bringing protractors and rulers are all I have. I want to have a straight line. And the second rule is that this vertical has to be perpendicular or 90 degrees to the horizon. So every time I do a straight line, or it's called a vertical line, it's going to be at 90 degrees to the horizon line. And any horizontal lines are going to be parallel to the horizon. So in this scenario, I'm going to have us do a cube. And to keep things simple, I can either take a mark from here to here, or wherever I envision that being, and transfer those same marks to the other side of the picture. I'm just trying to get you to see some of the things that you might see where you're sitting right now, the room you're in. And what I plan to do in this room is have, I'll do this here again so you can see it, is I'll take a distance, and from that line I'll just mark that same spot. So we know we're relatively square with this. Again, I'm not being exact with it because it's not that important. Keep in mind that we're supposed to have these lines perpendicular, so if I erase this, it's one less confusing thing on the paper. Imagine you're sitting in a room. In 1 point perspective, it implies that there's 1 point on this horizon line. And this point is called a vanishing point. And rather than writing it all out, I'll just put VP. Okay? From that vanishing point, any lines coming into the picture emerge. So if there's diagonals, they'll run to that vanishing point. You could do that for the top of this too. Sometimes it gets so confusing with these lines that it's better to use a different colored pencil, but in this case I'll keep it simple and I'll use a lot of erasing just so you understand where we are. At some point I might choose to put another line, and again we know the rule, so we'll keep that in mind, that we're basically trying to keep this perpendicular 90 degrees to the horizon line. Once I've started one side, and if everything works out well with the freehand approach I'm taking, then this line here should do the same, be parallel to the horizon. and so would the one underneath. And where they meet up, if I was accurate, should fall to a point where they coincide with each other. If I can ask you to trust me that I'm not changing much, except I'm going to erase these lines or break them up a little bit. So it's a trick, actually, if you ever want to change something, don't completely erase your lines. Just take a little bit less strength out of them or make them a little less strong by weakening them with the eraser. Not to get rid of them, because we might rely on them in the future, but I want to make this area the important part. So what I'm asking you to imagine in this situation is that we're walking into a room and there's a doorway right here. If you look around you, you know that the room you walked into had a door, and you didn't have to duck down to get through that door unless you're a tall person, so there are exceptions to every rule there are. But this doorway has to be higher than the horizon line, and your eye level is usually on the horizon line, so I'm giving the door some height above it. Okay, I'm going to take a line from that center vanishing point and cross those two previously made vertical lines. Now I've, in a sense, created a doorway. And to keep this going a little further, I'm going to erase that horizon line, which we could see through the door, but might be confusing, as would all these other lines, but I need them in there for a little while. If I want to give thickness to this wall, or width, I'll take another line and run it parallel to that first one. And remembering the rule that we're supposed to have any horizontal lines parallel to the horizon, I will now take the bottom of this door and do the same. Have this go parallel to that. I can now clean out a little bit of that area, and I've made an entrance into this room. And at the top of this door should be another line that's parallel to the horizon. If you've got that, we're on our way. Any diagonals can run off of that vanishing point, so I'm going to take this and find where that corner is and do the same. Okay. Thought I'd be tricky and turn my ruler over, and then I drew on the back of the ruler. But you get the idea where this is lining up. And now I've created a believable doorway. If I want to put that horizon in, I can do it again. I just don't want to confuse you, or I'll actually take it off of the wall. Okay. Now, in this scenario, you might decide to have a couch. And what I want you to think about is, again, I'm so used to drawing freehand, I don't want to use the ruler, but rather than trying to envision a couch here, it would be easier to take and think about the footprint that that couch would make if you lifted it off. I don't know if Chesterfield's the word I should be using in this country, but if it means the same thing, go with me, okay? If I take this line and bring it to the vanishing point, I'm now creating a believable footprint. Think of when you lift the bed or couch or whatever this is going to be off of the floor, that everything else may have had, it would leave a shadow, is basically what I'm asking. And up the wall, we already know has to be parallel or perpendicular, to the horizon. And I'll just draw the back of this Chesterfield. Okay? And I don't know how tall it's going to be, but this side of it will also need some height to it. Again, trying to keep it perpendicular to the horizon. Now I've created a back to the couch, and I don't know how tall we want it, but I'm going to take this line and bring it over to the vanishing point. Given the couch thickness, parallel again to the horizon, tells me that I know where that corner is, where that line ends, has to be straight up and down or perpendicular to the horizon. And if I stop here, not to confuse us with the other line, I'll just bring this out a little bit so I can see it, and bring it as far as this line would be if I drew it straight up. So I've taken and made an L in this situation and moved it away from the wall, and now I'm going to put a front to it. And that front is established the same way, where I'll just take this line and bring it further. You can understand how confusing it could be if I continue drawing line after line in one color and didn't erase them, but I'm trying to do this in a way that we'll see it quickly, digest it a little bit, and move on. So if I've taken this top and connected it with a perpendicular line, or sorry, parallel line to the horizon, I might want to clean out the inside of that and redraw it just so you see it a little bit better. And this corner here is confusing, so I'll take it off. At the front of the couch, right here, I'm going to draw a straight line up and down, and I'll freehand it, okay, just so you know it's meant to be straight. The only thing missing, we have a diagonal going to the center, but that doesn't tell us where the couch should be. If we take this angle here, the line would be a little bit higher. So I've now drawn from the corner of that L and the corner of this L to create the area that I could later put a pillow in if I wanted to. I'm making it a simple couch, but I think you get the idea. Think of a picture in a room. It's usually placed at eye level. So you're looking at the photo when you're standing. If I want to have a picture behind this couch, I might say that will be the line that I'll start in. And to that vanishing point, I'll draw a line at the top of that picture wherever I want it to be. Again, it's not touching the ceiling usually, it's at eye level. So I'll make a mark so I know I've got something to aim for with this ruler, and I'll put another line in. If I have a side to that painting or picture on the wall, it's got to be perpendicular to the horizon, and I might want it to match the couch in width, so I'll keep it relatively the same size. Okay? To confuse us less, I'll take out some of these lines so you understand how this picture now relates to that couch in this made-up room. And one more thing I'm going to do is put a little rug in front of this couch, and that rug will run back to the horizon and the vanishing point on it. And I can make it as big as I want with it parallel and perpendicular where it applies. Here it's more parallel because of this side, but the sides go back to that vanishing point. And on this end, I want it again parallel to the horizon. Okay. One last thing, and we're finished this exercise. Well, I could put one window in here just to clean up some of these lines, and I'll do that by giving us a view through a window, again parallel to the horizon, and the sides were perpendicular. So now I've got a room with a bunch of lines in it that I don't need anymore. And I'm going to take these out. So we can start seeing this as a surface, a plane that might be different from the wall we've cut the hole through. And one more thing I want to do just to illustrate the point a little further. If I look at this couch here and decide that maybe in front of it I'd like to put a coffee table, what I might do is, first of all, think about the footprint that table would occupy. And again, I'd take a parallel line to the horizon as the back, and the front would be parallel to the horizon there. Diagonals would go back to that single vanishing point. Remember, we're in 1 point perspective, and there is 1 point on the horizon line. All those diagonals go back to that horizon or vanishing point on the horizon line. This is a little dark, but I'll show you what I'm planning to do. If I take and give myself an arbitrary height here, I'm not saying it has to be exact, a line to represent the length of the legs, I can take a parallel line to the horizon and put that to indicate where the front edge and the legs meet. All of this underneath can be erased if I choose later, but I'm going to keep it in play for a second as I take some lines and run them back to that vanishing point. Now I've got what can be considered the top of the table, and remembering that any vertical lines go perpendicular to the horizon, I am going to just extend these legs a little higher up, and where they meet the lines that I've projected back to the vanishing point, I'll consider that the top of the table. It just so happens to coincide with the bottom of the wall. To clarify it a little bit easier, I'll take and erase a little bit of these lines. Sometimes I don't erase it completely if I want it to appear like glass, so I'll show you what I'll do in that instance. I will take away these base lines that were aiding in figuring out the footprint basically of this table, and I did remove some of this top, so I'll replace it. So now I've got a tabletop that in this case we're going to consider is more glass-like, and instead of seeing the legs in the same strength on all four sides, I might weaken those lines, put a little bit of a dot treatment there if that's necessary, or reinforce this by making them thicker. And then to finish it off, I may just do a little sweep for glass on top of it so that people know there's a surface there and it's not really meant to be opaque. So I can give the glass thickness if I want. I can even cast a faint shadow underneath, but that's all to take it to the next step. Remember what I've told you so far in the workshop, that every plane is going to be lit differently. So this surface here might be getting a different treatment than this door jamb here will. But the more coloring in you do, or using values, different pencils, the more you'll be able to establish the angles of the walls. In one-point perspective, there's two rules. Verticals are perpendicular to the horizon, and horizontal lines are parallel to the horizon. The horizon line is shared in 1 and 2 point perspective, but in 2 point perspective, you place two spots, unlike the 1 point perspective, as the name implies. With two spots, the only rule you have to concern yourself with is that any vertical lines are perpendicular to the horizon. Okay, 90 degrees to that. So if I take a ruler and establish a line, this line that I'm putting on can happen anywhere in this picture, but what I'm going to do is put it in the center for now. If I make it too tall, my structure gets too big, so I'm deliberately going to cut it down later, but just showing you that this line here is perpendicular to the horizon. And I'll erase any confusing lines that are already starting to show up. So from this line, I'm going to determine a spot that feels good to me, or right at the moment. There's no logic to it yet. But every line that comes off of that spot will go to one of the two vanishing points. So if I have lines going in this direction, I will bring them back to that vanishing point. If they're shared at the top, I might do the same just now to get this established. But if I want to give this structure some form, I might choose a spot, and again it's arbitrary, here. All I have to do if I'm going to draw a line there is make sure that it's perpendicular to the horizon. And in doing so, it would be parallel to its mate, the first line I drew. To vary things, I'm going to change up the width. And in previous examples, I used the piece of paper to gauge the distance, so I hope that everything's staying on track. But deliberately here, I might want to take that distance and elongate it, make it a little bit longer than the previous one. So I'll take this point and put another line parallel to this one, but more importantly, perpendicular to the horizon. To see a lot of lines going through this structure can get confusing. So dotted lines are what I'm going to rely on now. But if you had colored pencils and you wanted to use them, that would be fine also. And to make it not as cluttered as it could be, I'm not going to continue the lines all the way down. I hope that you'll be able to follow some of the marks that I've left. And from this vanishing point on the left-hand side, which I'll call VP1, and to this one on the other side, I'll just call it VP2 for vanishing point. I'm going to go from vanishing point 1 to the corner right here and do the same as I did previously with that other dotted line and create another dotted line to follow, because I know as this drawing progresses, I'm not going to really care about these lines and there's no sense establishing them any darker. The top of this particular line would slope towards that vanishing point. So I'm going to put it in likewise and only put in as much as I need to illustrate the point I'm getting at. From this vanishing point, this corner here would be drawn, and I'll take same dotted line and continue. So we could theoretically be seeing the inside of a building if I wanted to complete these lines and look at that same room that we did in the previous example from a different angle. But I'm going to choose this spot. I'll connect these dots so that you see the connecting point or the intersecting point of these lines. And I'll do the same at the top, just in that corner, to get an idea where those lines intersect. And if I've done it correctly, this should connect with that one at an angle that's perpendicular to the horizon, or close enough. Again, none of this will be seen beyond the example I'm using next. If I took this corner of this square or rectangle that I've drawn and connected a line to it with a diagonal, and this is just against this front plane of this building or structure, and did the same from the other corners. So connecting this corner to this one and this through this with a diagonal gives me the center point of this square in perspective. If I want to take a line and measure it, I'll just grab a scrap piece of paper and take this to here and this, translate that way. It's a lot easier for me than sitting with a ruler and looking at increments of inches or centimeters or millimeters or whatever it might be. I can then draw a line straight up through those points and leave it for now, and do the same as I did just previously with that front panel or plane by putting a diagonal line through the corners of these two corners. That gives me the same thing as I did here, but I'll take another piece of paper, mark those spots, and move it around that way. Connecting those dots, I can take a line straight up from that. At any point in this drawing, I have to involve myself in some decision making. Here, the first thing I'm going to do is clean off a lot of these unnecessary lines. Where the dotted lines were, I don't have to make as much of an effort because there's fewer lines to erase. It's not a continuous line. But in some of those other areas, I want to leave them in for future reference if I need them. I can always clean them up later. But I'm really going to knock them down with a little bit more pressure than I need to. And I don't need to see those lines very clearly. So I'm going to knock all this down and keep that framework sort of visible, but it's not going to be that necessary. Okay, I can even clean off a line like this that might have been a distraction. What I want you to see now is that I've taken this front or solid line here and this line and strengthened it a bit. I am going to keep these lines, but I want you through the camera to be able to see a little bit clearer what I've drawn here. So when I refer to the plane, this surface here and this surface here are the two planes I'm talking about. Imagine us having a building out of this shape, but we want to put a peak on a roof, for example. I have to at some point make a decision on how tall the building's peak will be. And in this case, I put a dot on this center line. And I'm going to connect this point to the vanishing point. And again, I don't need to press hard, but I do want to make sure that this line here is visible in the end. To make matters easier right now, I could extend this line a little further and bring it out from the front of the building, but I'm just going to rely on the corner of this to give me an angle that you'll see the importance of or the relationship to in a minute. I now have a peak or a point that I ended wherever I feel was right, and you're going to use your eyes to figure out what should actually be there when you're looking at a particular building. And I'm going to bring that eve out enough that when I get to this spot, I'll take it back to that vanishing point back there. Okay? If this gets confusing, you can soften some of these lines. But keep in mind that the same thing we use to establish the height of this and the slope of this can be used back here, where I have this spot crossing this line. I can now put my pencil and using that corner, draw a line out and be confident that the angle's right and it's where it should be. I'm now taking away some of the lines that were just used to draw things in with. I've mentioned before that I shouldn't be rubbing the paper with my hands, but it's a reminder that there are tools and implements you can use to keep your oils off the paper. This is purely a sketching exercise, so go ahead, do what you want, but bad habits can form if you let them. So I try to establish or remind you that there's a point in doing things. If you take this corner where this line meets the line going back to the vanishing point and draw it towards the other vanishing point, there's going to be a point where it crosses, so I'm basically drawing this line, and rather than dirtying it up, I'm just going to extend this a little bit further and use this height and this corner to complete the roof and the overhang. So by drawing that line to where that first line is, I've now created how tall or how far out it should go. But I don't have this angle right. So that was meant to help me establish how far down it goes. And I'll take that line off. And now I'll connect it to this corner. This corner goes to the vanishing point, and I now have it going back in the proper angle. It's a slight difference, but if you don't know to correct these things, you'll have a mistake and you're really not confident that you've got it right. In my world here, I could establish any kind of building. I could put one tall door and call it a shed, or a smaller, lower door and call it a house. So I'm still going to work with the middle of this to keep it simple and call this a 2-story building with an attic. And if I draw perpendicular lines to the horizon for the front of this door, or for the door in the front of this building, I'm eyeballing it using this dotted line that was the center line before that. And I'll take my vanishing point off to the right and continue this line so that it's flowing back into perspective. Had I continued these lines for the door jambs a little taller or a little further up, I would have ended up with maybe a place where I could put a window for the second floor. And every line that comes off of that window has to go back to the vanishing point on the right-hand side of my paper in this case. If you think of the house you live in now, the windows in each room are probably at the same height. So one of the things I want to remind you about is you can take a window like this here one that I established here and draw a line straight through to that vanishing point. Where that line runs into this corner is where the next row of windows would start if you had them in the second floor. So you could draw a line here. If you wanted the same height of window, then some of it would be covered by the eaves, but we'd have to do it a little differently. So I'm going to take and lower the side windows. I might use half a window height. And if I take that and bring it to this point, that will hit. So if I draw a line through the middle of that window to the vanishing point, it'll get me to that corner, which will allow me to find out where this next row of windows go. Again, I'll do my lines light because I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet in terms of the spacing between the windows. If I have a window here and I want to think about symmetry, and I'll do a bigger window below that, I might put a skinny window here and a taller one here. All those windows are going to be designed on the same premise, that these lines here that form the top and the bottom of this window will go towards that vanishing point. So this second story window is going to be using lines that go back to that vanishing point. But the first story window might be a lot higher since I've got more room. And it'll again have tops and bottoms that go towards that vanishing point. And you can continue doing that with all the windows if you desire to have more along this plane or this side of the house. So I really quickly wanted to go through 1-point perspective and 2-point perspective to show you that it's not the most difficult thing in the world. If you got some tracing paper and you got a man-made object, take a sheet of tracing paper and put it on top of a room or a house, a building that you want to draw. And again, trace those lines and see which of the two perspectives it falls into. There is a third, I won't confuse you with that now, but with the 2-point perspectives, you're going to cover probably 99% of the reference you have. Just be careful that the camera doesn't distort things and put lines on angles. And be sure when you're taking pictures, you learn to hold your camera square to the horizon so that your walls or your windows or your buildings have lines that are perpendicular to the horizon, and then you'll find that it'll be a lot easier to do your drawings. There's one thing that a lot of people don't rely on, and it's their imagination. What I get somebody to do is to take a marker, a colored pencil, something a little different than a pencil, and ask somebody in their household to make a mark, a squiggle, something. Just have somebody in the dark. It doesn't have to be, it could be the non-artist in the family. Tell them to make a few shapes, and then take those shapes, and with a pencil this time, try to make something out of it. I have no idea what these shapes are going to become, but try making something out of it. Design, start thinking about curves or whatever it might be. Shading could be an example we're going to learn about in this particular exercise here. Whatever it is that interests you, start making something out of those shapes. You'll find that you're going to start seeing things out of a simple shape that had no foundation, and use your imagination to get an image on the paper. If you were to think of this picture, the area you would not want to put anything is called dead center. Okay? Usually you'll see an artist divide a painting in thirds, and those spots where the lines connect are known as sweet spots. Okay? That's where you'd be better to place an object. Another way to arrive at those sweet spots is to take a diagonal from one corner to the other, find a halfway point, and go from that to the other corner. And these also end up being spots that you can hinge something like a bird or an element of the bird. It could be an owl or something in this case where you want to put it on a branch. If I show you a picture of this cardinal, its position is similar to where I was talking about previously, where I took a diagonal and I thought its eyes and its beak were the important parts. What I did with the background was do a gradation, but the branches also spiral to bring you to the final resting spot, which I want you to look at as the bird's beak. Composition isn't an accident. It's something you have to work hard at, but there's some things I want to remind you not to do. If you have a drawing surface and you want to have an element in that picture, fish in this case, don't have it bumping against the side of the picture. It's not going to feel comfortable to the viewer. If you have an area that you want that fish in, give it room to flow into the picture. If it's a bird flying, don't have it bumping itself into the frame. Leave room for it. Whether it's correct or not to have it at that height is up to you. When you do a landscape, there's the 1/3, 2/3 rule, where you should have a distinction between the amount of ground you use versus the amount of sky, or vice versa. If you want to have 1/3 ground and 2/3 sky, it'll still be better than taking that line and putting it through the middle of the picture, so avoid those things when you're doing your composition. When I'm doing my reference gathering, I've mentioned previously that I choose a left or right-handed light source. I think it's more interesting looking at an object and shooting it from one side or the other, as opposed to a washed out look that I get when I take a flash or shoot something with the sun right on it, or backlit. I don't enjoy that as much because things get put into the shadows. And this particular girl has what I'd consider a good light source. There's some reflected light coming in on this side and some warm, positive, strong light coming in from the right-hand side. As an artist that's doing pencil work, you might have distractions in here when you start thinking about the colors. One of the things I'd suggest to do is take your reference and make a black and white copy of it. print it out on a black and white printer, and you should get some good ideas of how your pencil drawing has to go. We're transitioning into something known as values. So as a teacher, I want to point out the importance of values and using them correctly. It doesn't matter which subject you're using. It could be people, but this light source is very flat, and not a lot of attention comes from this particular girl's contrast, light and darks. Neither does this one, where she's in the shadows. Beautiful pictures, if you see them in color, you get the idea of the jewelry or the beads that they wear, but you don't see that when you're doing a pencil study of it or a black and white study. In my studio, I don't have very much evidence of the actual drawings left. What I do have, though, is one that's in progress, and it's this Kestrel. You've seen it behind me for a while now. With this still in my studio, I thought I'd show you the step-by-step that's involved in the thinking to get to a point where I'm interested in that particular bird. I will take a 4x6 photo, and the first thing I'll do is enlarge it. So I'll get an 8x10 or an 8x12. The better your reference, the better your art's going to be. In this particular photo, this Kestrel was not up close. I had to get as close as I could. And the next thing I did was on my computer, enlarge it. But to get from this point to this point sometimes confuses people. They'll ask me, how do you ever think about what you want to crop into? And I've made myself a little tool. You've seen them before, but it's a cropping tool, basically. And I'll sometimes close this gap and figure out, this composition looks good, so I might take that particular angle. I have designed it so that it gives me a square format, and again, I could take that square, and if I like that triangle format a little bit better, that might be something I work with. What I'm left over is this small rectangle, which again, it's not perfect. I might decide to change something later on and crop it a little bit more, but it gives me something to start with. You can use this in the real world when you're looking at a three-dimensional scene, a landscape or whatever. I'm not saying I invented this. I'm just saying I cut it for myself. And it's just two pieces of card independent of each other, and they fit inside of one another and let you do some cropping. Nowadays we have computers though, and we're able to crop in. And that's another thing I'd tell you to take advantage of. Anything that's going to make your life easier. Don't be a slave to your photo. If you see something, start thinking about what it is that appeals to you. Working on the personality of the animal is what captures my interest. And if you want to do the same with a tree, I don't care what it is, start looking at that tree intimately, if you want to call it something. The next thing I did was take a sheet of tracing paper and find my circles. So either on the black and white or the color copy, I'll do the same thing. I'll break it down into shapes. The circles, I'm begging you to keep a circle in mind. If you can do that, you're making your life a little easier. And when you have your template, triangles and everything else can be drawn off of that circle. The orientation, think of the hands of a clock and what angles some of those things appear at, and you'll be well set. This is what remains of the transferring paper that I traced from my drawing to transfer this onto the board I do my paintings on. What I want to do is turn our attention to doing something that is going to have a little bit more permanence. To begin this demonstration, I'm going to try and spend more time on the detail after the initial drawing's done, but I want to take you through step by step, and it's going to involve a little preparation. So I'm starting with a blank piece of paper and a ruler or another piece of paper to mark the lines and decide if I'm going to have an edge or a margin on this particular one. A ruler makes it easier because I can take and draw the lines down the edge using a piece of paper and keeping the distance from the edge the same. What I'm trying to do is keep a handling edge, and you will see that when I draw these lines, I'm using my thumb along the bottom of this ruler to feel if it's in line with the edge of the paper. And I'm getting parallel distance or even spacing on both sides, so that if somebody does touch the paper here, I'm handling it with that, it's not the end of the world. When I finish, I'll actually have the picture matted, and the mat will cover a little bit of that line anyways. I'll take a strip of tape, start it on my line, and everything underneath will be protected and nothing will get underneath that tape. And I'll do it on this side also. I'm not sure where I'm going to end this picture, and I actually might in the demonstration move this a little closer, so I'm going to leave this for a minute and show you what I'm trying to achieve here. If I take this scrap piece of paper that I was using to rest my hand on and put a piece of tape down, if I grab some of this carbon dust or graphite with a pencil or whatever I wanted, however I wanted to apply it, I'm just putting a little bit on here without getting too much. And if I take a cotton swab and start darkening this area to the top of this tape from my view, you can see where the tape is half covered in graphite. And I can work with freedom in this area knowing I'm going to have a clean edge. Because when I take this tape off, it's not sticking, I just don't have the longest nails. I now have a clean mark left, and that is something I want to do. I want to keep the area here nice and clean. It's a way to present your work a little bit better to the potential buyer. What I want to do is avoid the tracing, projecting, or gridding, but again remind you to see things in those basic shapes. So taking a drawing, as I have a piece of reference in front of me, and converting it into lines is easy to do if you break it into chunks, little shapes, and work from that. I've taken that ground squirrel reference, the squirrel, and done some basic shapes on it so you could see that, but I'll show you once more how I'm going to come up with these shapes. And it's not going to hurt you to practice, even if it's the same thing a bunch of times, so that you'll learn how to vary things. Maybe one time you see it interestingly through triangles, and another time you see it more in circles. Resist the temptation to take your tracing and use it as a guide, size as, on your drawing. So I'm tempted always to take and do it as a smaller version. I still want to see detail, but that will keep me from using that to check if I'm off, because after a while it gets frustrating if you're the tiniest little bit off and you know that you've got this as your guide. But I want to show you how I'd go through this. I'll take and try to find the circle that's in the head. It's going to help me down the road find a new way to look at this as a linear drawing. If you have an eye that's visible, draw it as a round circle. When you look at the eye itself, you'll see that it's not a circle. So later you're going to be able to take and draw a line through that, but you're still going to have the feel of that circle there. I'll try in some cases to fit the circle in there, but because so little of that eye shows, I just want to remember that it is on that drawing in a certain location, and it'll come into play later. There's nothing wrong for you to take and flip your paper. So if you can't see something and you got to keep checking, you're actually teaching yourself to memorize. So to put a circle in here, you might want to flip and check to see if you've actually got it in the right place. There's nothing wrong because we're trying to get this into a simpler form as we're trying to learn. If I want to simplify it even as a circle, remember previously I was drawing the fingers of the hand. You see some of the structure that's taking place on top of this particular drawing. But this is what I need to start my drawing with. I want to leave a little bit less room on this side and more on this side. So I'm going to move my circle over a tiny bit. Whatever that width is, if I'm not confident about my circles, I can mark off some of the area. I want to keep my lines a little less visible. I'm going to get myself a clean piece of paper to put underneath my hand and remind you that if you're doing any erasing, hopefully your lines are thin enough that you can do it without a lot of pressure. We don't want to damage the paper. If I've already got smudges on here, I'll clean it up. If I took that bigger circle and divided it in half, that's where I see this circle starting. but it goes a little bit beyond that circle. So I will take and do the same thing here, is I'll locate a line that lets me know where this other circle is going to start. So I'm looking at this leftover space and I'm trying to figure out if this starts looking right. So right now I've eliminated the need for rulers, but if I take that same width and draw this circle up to here, I should start seeing something that looks similar to what I started with that tracing. The next thing I want to do is figure out where half of that circle is. And I'll divide that by drawing a line through it in both directions, making 4 quadrants. That helps me locate this eye, and from a glance you can see that this eye, this circle here, comes right about to center, and it's just below or sharing that line on the horizontal. Now I'm starting to see similarity between the gap or the distance here and here, the way I did on my actual tracing. So I see a little bit of room here and a little bit of room, almost an eyeball height above it. And if I've got that happening, I'm feeling pretty confident. I can always adjust, but I'm still keeping these ghost lines. If I took this line and continued it up a little further, I might notice that the ear comes out to that point. All the time I'm using my brain to measure something. I'm thinking, is this height from here to here the same as the eye height? If it is, I got lucky, but I have to keep checking things in my brain or testing for ways to see something. So I might take something as simple as that and check it against that eye and go, yeah, it's pretty close. So that means whatever my eye height is here, it has to correspond the same way that this eye does to that ear on my drawing. If the unit that I'm using for my eye is this tall, the ear has to also share that height. Okay, 2 things. Whatever happens here with that eye in relation to its other parts, my eye has to work on this drawing. I want you to think about the whole thing in the relationship. If I draw lines down and see where this circle shares almost the same circle as the hand, I might start blocking it in. I'm looking at the space between them and realize that this could be a little higher or this could be a little lower. I can adjust things. I'm trying to get things blocked in first. This circle that I started with initially can be broken into angles, and you start seeing times of 8 o'clock being here, 7 o'clock being here. At 7 o'clock on this circle, when I draw from the center, is where the wrist should start, and the other one shows where the back leg will start. I'm just going to start freehanding some things in. It's okay. Start developing habits where you can train your eye to move your hand in a certain way. The more I train myself what to look at in nature, the easier it's going to be to draw. Think of that pie shape just as being angles that you can automatically see. 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, whatever it is. And you'll have a quicker hand to paper transition. And maybe the most important thing to do now would be to take that eye and just put that little shape in it. That's all I was able to see tracing from this particular piece of reference. That's the way I see an animal in the wild. Breaking it down into those shapes makes it easier to get it from a 3-dimensional vantage point down to a 2-dimensional surface. It helps me to clean them up now instead of smudging a lot of work later on. If I'm using a big eraser like this and I'm taking off too much, that's where I'll go to that smaller point on this eraser and I'll take and leave smaller lines. I know that in this instance I'm going to want to have some fur that appears to be faint and going off into the background. But I don't want to lose a lot of time doing this because I'm going to do some work in the background to tone it first. I'd rather tone this background, even though it means there's a potential of me smudging it. I'd rather get this outline established so that I can do some background work and not leave a halo around the animal when I try to do it later, afraid to get some of the fur I've spent time doing messed up. I'm going to take a graphite stick, and on top of this one I've marked a 6B. It's hard to see, but I will shave a little bit of this off, and I'll try to mimic the background that I see in this particular reference piece. This area here is dark, and I might actually darken this background a little bit more, but within reason I'm trying to show you that you can do a gradation. And the first thing I'll tell you about a gradation is it needs to start evenly. As light as this is here, I want to do that tone over everything and do a second coat and a third coat and a fourth coat if I want to darken things. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on this because I don't want a lot of swirls to show, but I am conscious of the value I see in this corner being darker, and further away I'm going to let it fade off. One of the problems I'm trying to avoid here is getting what's known as a halo. If I stop putting pressure on this paper or bringing this color right up to the edge, then I'm going to have an area, maybe too light or too dark in some cases, that is that transition zone from where I was afraid to get too close to the animal with too much color, and I end up making it look like it's glowing or it's a holy squirrel. So go right into the background. I haven't recorded or kept that shape that I was using, but I can still see it. At the very end of this, I'm going to take the paper and blow off any of the excess. Spend some time drawing the actual contour of this animal. This is all I would need to retain the outline of that particular animal. Take another clean sheet of paper, place the two on top of each other, and with the scalpel, cut through. You'll see that I can score both things, and I'm actually going to lose my drawing, but that's okay. You can cut right through. I left my cutting mat at home. Take some more graphite and continue the process. And if I tear that piece of paper away along those score lines, I'll take that shape and hold it over top of my drawing, so that if I want to protect a certain area, like the tape's purpose is, I can now rub right off of this initial cutout and protect the surface from getting a lot of color underneath. And again, avoiding that halo effect, because now I'm bringing the color or this value right up to the edge. And when I remove the paper, I now have, when I clean it off, a hard edge that's protected. This fur here has to have something happening in it. The white area here even has some color in it. There's not much to stop me from doing little lines all along the edge or area behind the head. And I'm treating the background area as a starting point, because if I'm working on this particular area, I'm learning. If I've never drawn before, it makes sense to me to learn where it's the least important. And then as I get better, I'll apply everything I've learned in those out-of-the-way areas to where it really matters, which is the head. So I want to just start doing some fine lines in pencil, sharp point, and I'm not worried about the value or the strength, because I'm doing, as I did this background, the lightest area over top of this whole surface first, and then I decided where I wanted to put the darks. In pencil, I'm doing the same. I'm going to take the same areas and just put in some light lines. Where I'm interested in preserving white is right around this eye, where the eye doesn't have a lot of the same interest that the human eye had or other animals have. So I'm going to take and try to put some interest in there, but keep that dark, beady-eyed look surrounded by the lights. I will generally build the whole area up first with fine lines, and then I'll do successively darker coats of lines. And don't do your lines where you do row after row after row. Think of sometimes staggering your lines, making some start in different places, and even moving your pencil so you don't complete a row. Go somewhere else, and then move here, and then go over here. And by the time you finish, you'll have covered everything, but there's going to be more randomness to it, not like rows of grass. And even angle them different. So it's okay if you knit them into each other. And I'm trying to get these hard lines established first. If you look every so often, you'll see that 9H is not visible. I'm not doing it on purpose. at this point of moving it, but I will rotate this so my point always stays sharp, or I'm getting the consistent line strength out of it. But I want to again point out I'm looking for the length of the fur, I'm looking for gaps in it, I'm looking for the direction of it. I'm going to break these down into cylinders, and maybe a circle. At the center of that, I might just draw a straight line for the claw, or I can develop that a little further. And on this paw, I will do the same. I'll use cylinders. On this reference, I've traced the one paw and the other, and I might do this one first and just start working in that unit what I see happening down here. Originally I contained it with a circle, and now I'm fitting everything into that circle. We've got room to move if we didn't get it perfectly. It's easier for me to take this sheet of tracing paper, flip it upside down, and draw on the back of this. Put what I need down. I'm putting more information than I have to, but I can now position this back where I want it. Remember, that eye is where I'm registering things. And by pressing down on just the information I need, whether it's the outline or the edges or the inside structure or the claws, I can put as much information as I need on there now. And if I don't intend to work on this particular hand right now, I've at least got a framework that I know I can work around it with. I don't want them too hard, but they're there and I can block them in and erase what I don't want. Now when I'm working with the fur, I can work around that area and not feel like I'm damaging something. I'll do the same one with the other paw, where I'll take it, contained in this area, shows me something to go by, and I'll draw the other shapes. So now I've figured out the areas I've got to avoid putting the fur in, and basically drawn the paw. There's an area along here that's reflected light, and I'd like to get some of this in the harder pencil because it does make it easier to track that line. If later I want to put some dark around it, the fact that this 9H has gotten a foothold will help it stay a little lighter than the areas I might put a dark in, so I'm doing that right now. As tempting as it may be to go in and put dark where you know things are going to be dark, give it a little bit of time. We might not want to be that hasty because you can always add dark. It's just harder to take it away. And even now that I'm doing lines, I want to start doing them in the direction of the fur instead of going like this where it might be harder to disguise. There's a dark color to the edge of these hairs here, fur, and I want to make sure that I'm going to get the value I want as I get closer to the final drawing, meaning this background has to be the right value so that these lines will show up against it. So I'm going to continue with light lines. If I see a line like this that I don't need anymore, I can take the minute and erase it. It's not going to hurt it. I'm really conscious about the dark area, so I want to get some of these lines established there because these are what will show. These lines that I'm putting in will show as highlights or lighter areas in the shadows, so I'm trying to get some of this established first. Too much light here with too much dark fur will lift the fur forward, and what I want is this part of the animal to emerge. So I'm going to tone down the amount of contrast I have in the background so that the fur color I use here is the same value as I use in the background, so the two are hardly noticeable. As I work back here though, my fur line should be really short because it is fur that's off in the distance. It's not as long or as visible as this up close stuff. I will start using my lead holders soon, especially when I get into the darker fur. I can put the eye where it belongs, and in this case, these bands are what I'm interested in. It's a lot easier to draw when I have no consequences. I'm going to just take and draw this. If I don't like it, I don't have to use it, but it might guide me to where those stripes should be. But I'm doing it on tracing paper. I'm thinking on a surface that's not going to be damaged if I don't like it. So this area here might be my dark, and I don't have to resort to this. I can flip and see if I want to put my lines in or draw it the way I showed you how to do the paw. Just putting lines in won't be that much of a problem. In these dark areas, I may as well commit to a little bit of dark to let myself know where I am and to test out a few things. So I might do some small marks in there, not trying to cover the whole thing, but it's not going to hurt to switch around if I'm not sure if I want to go dark. I might be just trying to figure out the value I need in this area and need to put the darks amongst it to figure if I've got that value established or if it's light or dark enough. I might want to hide that line that existed when we did our background a little bit, so I'll break it up with little strokes with the pencil. At this point in the drawing, I've drawn in the ear to try and figure out what I need to do behind it. I had a big white area here, and trying to fit the shade or the value of dark around this ear was getting difficult because I had nothing consistent to compare to. I've left a little rim around it in case I do decide to leave a highlight in there. Generally, I'm just trying to block in or bring in the fur closer to that particular ear. When I work on the other one, I notice that it needs to be drawn a little bit out of the dark. It's sometimes easier if I'm doing light fur to erase a little bit more and then draw the dark into the fur. So right now I will continue with my lines, and I'll work with a harder pencil as long as I can to get some of those light lines in. So in my hands, I've got an HB, and the HB might be something I use to come around the front of this where I notice it's darker. Work with your values to change or create the effect that you desire. If I wanted that ear to jump out, I would darken it behind it or leave the light in front of it. And I might do those decision-making things towards the end, but I want to still get the feeling of fur and the direction it's going to take. I'll put a little bit more lines over that white to show the direction that fur will be, and then I'll walk away from it, not trying to finish the head. I'm just trying to get things blocked in at that particular point. Putting a sharp point on it, I might be able to put a few lines amongst the light lines that I've drawn and still keep a sparkle, so it's not going flat into one color. Any lines I bring off of this area are going to show up a lot more because the background's lighter than it is over here. And that was the intention from the very beginning, to take something that would lift off or hold down if I wanted that. And in this area, that's what I'm doing. Here I'm trying to get the background and the fur to almost join each other, to meld in. I know that's not what happens in the photo, but this area is so unimportant. I'm not trying to make it more important by having it stand out. By now you should know everything you need to know about pencil grades, and you'll choose some that work better for you than others. I prefer to use these selected values and limit my collection a little bit. There's an expression that what you discover on your own is more exciting than what somebody teaches you. So if I tell you everything you're ever going to need to know, you'll never discover anything on your own, and that can be a pretty boring existence. Put some of these tricks to the test, but try other things, and put your own signature on your painting by the style you choose to work in. I really hope you pick up your pencil, draw, experiment, and take away from this workshop something that you can apply to other areas of your life. Whether you're using a brush, just remember that painting is drawing in color. And some of the same things you learned today with values and basic shapes can be applied through any medium you're using. As I'm working on the nose here, what I find easier to work with is a circular motion. The fur on the nose is short. I could stipple a little bit of a dot pattern. I'm trying to make a transition. Sometimes fur gets so short, instead of long lines like this, it's easier to do the dots as if it's standing up on end. If I show you this pencil, think of it as a piece of fur or two hairs side by side. As it comes straighter up, you just see the ends of the points, and that's what you see with fur that's really short. In the nose, it's not just short hair. It actually may be the texture. If you think of your cat or your dog in the house, take a look at the nose and see that there is pores. It's like our skin almost, but not a little softer. There is a fur coating to some of these, but in other cases they're not. So changing your stroke to show a different texture is not the worst thing. When I get to its claws, that will be a little different also. Beak of a bird might be different, but in fur, I'm just trying to get the straight lines to differentiate from the nose, which I'm using a circular motion. I'm going around this face now and just blocking in the same way I did when I started the back to start putting in some of the harder lines. I was using up until now a 6H. I'm working with an H here because I want this shadow side to be a little darker. Right where my pencil is, here is where I'm working here. And by putting these in a little less light tone, it's easier to remember where I am, and what I'm trying to say here is reflected light is hitting the edge of this cheek. If I want to put things on layers, overlapping, I have to darken this, but I can't darken this area too much or it won't show up against the dark underneath. If I keep darkening this, I can darken this a little bit more and build the layers on top of that. Still have a little bit more dark to put in here, but I'll switch to an HB to do that. Sometimes the reference, as nice as you can get it, it's still deficient in some areas. So in here, the technique is almost scumbling. It's faking in detail because nobody's going to care what's in that shadow. And if your reference is as good as it can get, then you're going to have to step out and, dare I say it, invent something. It's not something I encourage you to do a lot of, because inventing can lead to a problem, and that's getting generic looking things. If you don't bother getting reference of the tree you're going to paint, you can do one or two with no problem from your head, but the third, fourth, seventh is going to be a lot like the first three. So I will stress that it's better to get your own reference, load up with more than you need. In this example here, I have lots of pictures of this particular animal in different poses. So I could figure out the detail on that nose if I really wanted to show you it. But right now I'm just drawing so you get an idea of how to continue. And again, I'm trying to leave you with the tools in your toolbox that will make your drawing experience a lot easier. If I take that template I cut out before, if I put it back on and wanted to darken the background, I could. But don't throw anything away until the drawing's over, because you might actually want to come in and use that to protect your background. If you're working in a certain area, you've already got a window cut out, why not rest your hand on that? There's no reason you shouldn't do it, except maybe you lose the feel of what the background's offering to the final painting. So keep these things in mind. You might use them later. I still plan to do a little bit more on the face. This was my original drawing, the thing I transferred onto the surface. If you look at it, this area here is where the eye is, and I might want to relocate that eye again. So it's easier for me to take this, trace just what I want off of there, and take that sheet out. And now I've got that eye in the right position so I can flip through. It's still that opened area here. But if I had lost a spot because I had been fooling around or smudging near it, it's nice to know I've still got the drawing, even in that initial stage, at hand. And if you take a careful look at the eye and the reference, there's a little bit of a highlight along the edge. And I don't want to lose that. That might be the little reflected light that's going to differentiate it from the background or the fur next to it. and I'll just do a sliver of dark next to that sliver of light. And that keeps a little bit of life happening on that far side of the picture should somebody want to locate that other eye. Then I'll just continue darkening some of that fur around it. So far on the forehead, I haven't done a lot of the dark lines, but I'm starting to put some in from this side over. And I don't want to, despite the temptation to walk away from an area, I don't want to leave this as white as it is, so I've got to darken it. So I'm going to start darkening things when I feel comfortable with the values I'm achieving. It's been a while since I stood up and looked at the work from a distance. I'll grab my plexiglass, which I can then look at both things together and see how my values are coming. I recognize that this could be a little bit darker, so could this here area, and areas under here might also need a little bit more adjusting. I'm still going to get darker, but that's a slower process. I mean, I'll build it up, and I'll give it a little bit more dark here, which I have barely started putting the fur in. I'm again trying to make the interest happen around here, so I know that the white spot in the eye, or near the eye, these lid areas, are going to be brighter only if I make the area next to them darker. Watercolor artists are notorious for leaving too much white, and that'll weaken or drain out the painting. The colors just don't seem as vibrant if there's so much white to detract from it. So I'd always encourage you, with your pencil, to go that little extra and make it darker if you think you can get away with it. I've told you in the workshop that ruining a drawing is okay to do if you're going to learn something from it. And one of the things I think you will learn is that in a lot of cases, you stop too early. I might just locate it, and I'll hold both pieces of paper in place and remove the one when I've put a little dent in it. So I'm scoring the paper a tiny bit. It won't be something that you can see, but it's enough to show me where I've indicated a dot should be. So I'm taking a hole, making it in a piece of paper, and because that highlight is so small, it's a good place to start. So I might just take the eraser and work my way through that paper and seeing if I got the highlights started where I want it. I do, so I can take that hole and make my life a little easier by making it a tiny bit bigger. And in this case, I'm pressing from the inside out now. And I'm going to peel back that opening and just erase. Sometimes it's not pure white I'm looking for, but in this case I am. If I want it bigger, and since it's happening right before me and it just coincidentally is the right size, I can use an erasing shield placed over top of that same spot and do the erasing through it. Now it might take some time to do it. I'm not in a hurry. I'm just trying to get it accurate. And I can make this hole bigger because it's so dark around it. And when I take it out, that starts to be my highlight. Still not happy with how bright it is, so I'm going to put this shield back on and go to plan B, which is to use an eraser that lets me push down harder. There's more substance to it, and try to take out a little bit more than I have to. If you put too much black on the paper, you can lose it in the fibers of the paper, but I think we're okay here. And a lot of times what I'll do is just put that highlight in and soften the edges a tiny bit so that it's not as obvious that I've erased it, and still keep that white. With animals like this, it's very little of the pupil and the iris that you see, but the highlight on the eye makes a big difference. Another option would be to take an erasing shield and use an electric eraser. It would let you get down to the paper pretty quick and ensure that you got as much of the dark removed as possible. I'm not worried here about the amount of white showing because I know I'll embellish it a little bit more with the darks that I end up placing in this fur. To do fur, I want to either push in this direction or pull in this direction so that it's getting darker here or here and trailing off as I lift the pencil. So by turning it in this direction, I'm going to start at the base of the fur and pull and hope to get thinner strokes at the end of my stroke. All I'm taking is the very flat part of the pencil on its side, and I'm scuffling it in a sketch-like but different grip direction. It's a sketchy surface. I'm trying to create some of this texture, and it's up to you how you want to demonstrate it. I will take and soften this probably with the blending stump, but to get some of it on, it's easier to build it up with the edge of the pencil, and it's a different texture altogether than the fur I've been doing. You got to be careful you don't press too hard and get some of the color off of the shaft of the pencil, but you can see where I've put an outline for this shadow area, and that'll let me bring some of this right across that line. But if I'm at risk of losing it, I'll just intensify the shadow with a little bit more pressure. But I still sometimes want the texture to flow right through, so I'll carry it off of the shadow into the daylight and continue that throughout the rest of this foreground. If I don't want to do too much more, I'll just take a softer pencil. This is a 2B here, and try it. I was using a 9H here, and it might just be a good time to experiment. Try something different. If you've never done this before, use the side of your pencil. Anything's possible. Anything's allowable if it gets you the effect you want. Remember, there are no such thing as mistakes, just techniques waiting to be used somewhere else. A lot of the paintings and drawings I do end up taking place over many days, not minutes or hours as this one started and finished in the same sitting. There's not a lot more I do. I want to put whiskers in, I want to finish this hand, I want to build some of this detail in the rocks, but you get enough of an idea to know where I'm going with it. As my time with you draws to a close, and that pun is intended, I wanted to show you something that I hope you'll take home with you. A lot of artists or young artists, beginners, come up to me and think that they're never going to reach a level of an artist they aspire to be because they've had too much time head start, the artist they're thinking of. So I want you to think of this spot as the area where you believe the best artist you know is now residing. That artist, in some cases, is thought to be on a slope like this, and you think you're down here, just beginning, and that it's going to take you that long to get to that point. What I want to remind you about is that the actual learning curve is not this line. You're going to head up pretty quick and get onto a path that's going to lead you to that same point. That artist is actually traveling on that same line. You'll learn a lot fast, and you're going to, for the rest of your life, get better. Art is one of those professions where the more you work at it, the better you get. What you learn today on a painting is going to be applied to your next one. What you learn in your drawing is going to be applied to your next drawing, so that each day you're going to be better than you were the day before. That's a pretty neat experience. There are athletes out there who peak in their 16, 28-year-old range, and from then on it's a decline. But as an artist, for the rest of your life, you're going to get better. So I'm hoping that through this workshop that you've learned a few things, that you can throw away some of those crutches you were relying on. Spend that hour a day doing something you enjoy, and I hope it's going to be drawing. And in 5 years, they say you'll be an expert. Remember that quote I used in the introduction that said that so-called talent is nothing but mile after mile of pencil on paper. My hope is that you'll pick up your pencil and draw and begin your journey today. I want to wish you all the best and thank you for being with me in this workshop.